I would not describe the citizenry as complacent. I would describe populists around the world as somewhat dispirited, lacking in leadership. People wonder where to turn. And every now and then we see a glimmer of leadership which we need to grab onto with both hands and join. And that leadership never comes from politicians, despite the fact that I could tell you I was the great new leader. It's not what it's about, not even remotely. The leadership is all coming from the grassroots, and it's coming from youth. And if you were part of the movement for October 24th, International Day of Climate Action, you'll know what I say is true. If you relied on the Canadian national news media, you won't know that Canada held more events on October 24th, International Day of Climate Action, than any other country in the world. There were over 5,000 events in over 180 nations around the world. And the genius of Bill McKibben, who started the 350 movement, was to have a goal, an objective, a name, and a slogan that was numerical. It wasn't until the end of the day I went to my computer to look at the 350.org website, and then again the next day to see how many new photographs were uploaded from all around the world. So from the Amazonian rainforest, children gathered around a poster that just said 350. From the pyramids of Giza, people gathered around a slogan and a banner that said 350. One of the ones that I found very moving was American soldiers in Afghanistan who'd taken their khaki-colored various blankets and formed 350 in the sand. You went around the world, and despite differences of language, differences of culture, from school children in Ghana to underwater scuba diving photos of Australians in the Great Barrier Reef, every message was the same, 350. Now, that genius, that was the largest international manifestation for any issue in the history of our planet, in the history of humanity. To me, it was a real crystallization of what Paul Hawken described in his book, Blessed Unrest. This is a whole lot of people without the great leader, without the great book. This is a movement that's so embedded in the hearts and minds and spirits of people around the world that they don't need that one kind of political leadership. And with a spark, and of course with the advent of internet to be able to do this, to invite people around the world to join in one day, the fact that Canada held the most of those. There were 3,000 people on Parliament Hill. There were 10,000 people on the bridge in Vancouver. But there were also small demonstrations, a couple hundred people on Salt Spring Island. There were people in and of course in Toronto. There were cities and towns and villages of all sizes. My daughter was on the Halifax Commons, cold and in the pouring rain, which was also the conditions in Ottawa. I'm not sure what it was like in Toronto, cold and pouring rain. And there were at least 1,000 people on the Commons in Halifax. None of this, unfortunately, was communicated to the Canadian public as a major event, because through all kinds of parallel to the crisis in democracy in terms of the lack of people who vote is the crisis in our news media. We have, at this point, a crumbling, dysfunctional national news media, whether it's through recession or through corporate concentration of ownership, whether it's lack of resources or fundamental bias, this issue isn't getting covered. And when you have that many people gathered in so many places across the country, and it doesn't make it to the Globe and Mail website or the pages of the paper, you know, something's wrong here. Because this was an international event where Canadians really took hold. But that's just to say, I don't think we can describe the public as complacent. We can't describe the citizens who don't vote as apathetic. I've increasingly realized, before I move to the topic of climate, just a brief note on voting, because it really matters. I notice over and over again since I've become involved in politics, and as Adriana said, it's not that long, it's for me since 2006. I spent the rest of my life before that in nonpartisan, non-government work. But what I'm finding, and it's a big surprise to me, is the number of people who choose not to vote as an act of protest. Now this is an abject failure as protest. This is a protest against Stephen Harper, which falls into his master plan. He doesn't want you to vote. The whole strategy of the Conservative Party in the 2008 election was to reduce voter turnout. I can prove it any which way to Sunday if you want to talk to me about it later, but the strategy of the Conservative Party was to discourage voters from going out to vote. So he lost some votes. Sure, the Conservatives had fewer votes in 08 than in 06, but they could take that hit because their strategy was to have a larger number of people dispirited and not voting for the other parties. And we were the only party that increased our vote. So this isn't a political speech, it's not partisan. I really want to convey the message that for those of you who are looking forward to whenever the next election is going to be, as one of many themes of this talk, which will be about get engaged and take action and make it personal, one of the things we have to do is persuade our friends and neighbors that voting is a very effective form of protest. That voting is not a consumer activity which you can choose to ignore because you don't like the shop. This is a sort of consumer culture that we live in, and we identify ourselves as consumers, and we are identified as consumers more than we're identified as citizens. And I think an ancillary effect of that has been to convey that notion that when you don't like the policies of a certain store, that the boycott of that shop, you vote with your pocketbook, makes sense. But this isn't shopping. Voting is an expression of a citizen's right to say what kind of future we want. And it's actually a powerful way of exerting our voice in the world. And when people choose not to vote, we've got to spread this word to people. You are only rewarding those people whom you find most despicable. And you are only hurting yourself and the rest of the society that would rather that we had better leadership than what we have. And in terms of polling, Canadians are not following the route of the US citizens whose poll results have been paraded through Canada as if they applied here. I was meeting earlier today with the editorial board of the Globe and Mail, and they said, what about the fact that Canadians don't care about climate change now that there's a recession? So I challenged them, and I said, I haven't seen any polls that say that. As a matter of fact, Harris Dessman did a poll on precisely that point and found that over 70% of Canadians, as recently as about a month ago, said that even in a time of a recession, they expected their government to mobilize resources to shift the economy to deal with the climate crisis. They did not expect the climate or environment to be ignored because of an economic recession. Now, it's true that the Pew Center in the United States has found that's not happening in the US. But in terms of the Canadian public opinion results, as far as we know them, Canadians are still very concerned about climate and want to see action. So that's another sign that we're in a country that has some fairly, at this point, deeply rooted core values around ensuring that we live on this planet as if we planned to stay.